All right, so yesterday it seemed like we were getting a little bit of good news on the situation over in Israel and Palestine, where Israel's government basically came forward and announced that they had voted to enact a ceasefire. Now, they didn't really give any major details to this ceasefire, how it would be operating, when exactly they would be stopping, and how. So it was obviously just a tentative situation, but nonetheless, of course, CNN immediately jumped in to give fawning praise to Joe Biden, who did literally nothing during this entire crisis to prevent any of the war crimes or the ongoing ethnic cleansing that Palestinians are suffering under. So here's what CNN had to say. President Biden, having weathered the first major foreign crisis of his presidency, touted a ceasefire deal that appears to end the bloody 11-day conflict between Israel and Hamas. Obviously, we've looked at the civilian casualties on both sides, and nobody likes a loss of life on either side. And both sides have war criminals to answer for with Hamas and Israel. But if you look at the actual civilian casualties, I mean, Gaza had 230, I think, was the end count, including dozens and dozens of children. And Israel suffered, I think it was 12 total casualties throughout this entire thing. So it's completely disproportionate which side suffered the most during this conflict. And it's not really a conflict. It's, again, an ongoing ethnic cleansing. But of course, CNN steps in to give Biden all of this heaping praise, even though, again, he did literally nothing throughout this entire crisis. All he did was come out and say Israel has a right to defend themselves and didn't make a single comment or condemnation of any of the things that Israel was doing, which, again, are blatant war crimes that they have been committing out in the open. So there's CNN, and obviously with this being a fragile situation, it's important to not jump the gun, as they clearly did with this headline, because this morning, Israeli police stormed Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque hours after the Israel-Hamas ceasefire, firing rubber bullets and stun grenades at Palestinians. Witnesses say some Palestinians stayed after Friday prayers to celebrate the ceasefire. Police claim there were riots. Here are some of the pictures on the ground. Very clearly, this woman is aggressively rioting, right? And not these guys. Okay, so that's how they want you to see the situation. Again, attacking one of the third holiest site in Islam, and you see people running away. But here, this is why this is important, okay? Because Hamas, which again receives very fair criticisms for their indiscriminate attacks on Israeli citizens, but the demands that Hamas was making from the beginning during this crisis were extremely reasonable. They had two major demands. And those two major demands were, one, don't fucking attack the third holiest site in Islam with your security forces. And two, stop the illegal, under international law, expulsion of Palestinians from their homes in East Jerusalem, specifically in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. And so those were the two demands that Hamas was putting forward for a ceasefire. Those are very reasonable demands. Not only are they reasonable demands, but they are demands that are simply asking Israel to act in correspondence with international law. Okay, so whether or not you have approval of Hamas or what Israel is doing, they were literally just asking Israel to follow international law. So extremely reasonable demands, and yet one day or less than one day after this supposed ceasefire, they're again attacking the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And the other reason why this is important is because this is what originally sparked this entire situation. Okay, Israel and their security forces were forcefully expelling Palestinians illegally from their homes in East Jerusalem, which is occupied by Israeli security forces when that's illegal under international law. And in combination with the attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, those were the two major things that prompted Hamas to fire rockets at Israel, which then prompted Israel to go and begin their indiscriminate campaign of violence against civilians in Gaza. So that's what this situation was started with. And here comes Israel less than one day after the ceasefire, doing the exact same shit. So what does this tell you? It tells you that Israel doesn't want peace right now. They don't want peace. If they wanted peace, they would stop doing this shit. Okay, so they are still aggravating and agitating, hoping that Hamas will retaliate for these types of attacks. And they're hoping that Hamas will retaliate for these types of attacks so that they then have an excuse to go and continue their bombing campaign in Gaza. So it's very transparent what the insane, racist, far-right government of Netanyahu is doing in this moment. He's really just looking out for his own political interests, and his political interests happen to be in riling up his base, similar to how Trump does with anti-immigrant rhetoric and national defense and nationalistic rhetoric. They're doing the same thing that Donald Trump does here in the United States. It's the same type of rhetoric, the same type of escalation, and then victim blame claiming of the people that they are oppressing. So you see the overlap there between the two countries. But I mean, again, the point beyond just this immediate moment and whether this ceasefire is going to last, or whether they're going to continue the violence, beyond that, even if the ceasefire is successful, which I really do hope that it is, even if the ceasefire is successful, well, that doesn't stop the underlying conditions that are continuing for Palestinians. That doesn't stop the apartheid policies of Israel. That doesn't stop the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. That doesn't stop any of this. Okay, Gaza still remains to be, whether or not there's a ceasefire, completely controlled by Israel from all sides, literally on whether it's their navy that's sitting off the coast and won't let their fishermen go out past a certain point, the total embargo of what Palestinians in Gaza are able to import or export. They control their water, they control their electricity. So none of this changes. Gaza still remains an open-air prison, the largest, most densely populated open-air prison in the world. And the continued policies of apartheid will continue indefinitely into the future, whether or not this dies down, whether or not this immediate conflict disperses. And so that's the situation that we have right now. It seems like Israel is literally trying to provoke Hamas into action so that they have an excuse to go back into Gaza and continue their bombing campaign. But I mean, we've seen the destruction that has been caused up until this point. An overwhelming majority of the people that have been killed have been civilians. And if you don't know anything about Gaza, I mean, Gaza, almost half their population is children. And Israel is continuing to indiscriminately obliterate their infrastructure. They've destroyed hospitals. They have destroyed roads. They have destroyed residential buildings. They have destroyed bookstores. They have destroyed all of these different things that are just civilian infrastructure. And of course, they're going to claim that Hamas is literally residing in every single building in Gaza. But they've completely obliterated this infrastructure. They've killed hundreds of people. And this is the situation that we're left with: a very, very, very fragile ceasefire that is yet to be seen whether or not it's going to last. But it's very clear from this point that Israel is not interested in maintaining any sort of peace. And in fact, they are continuing to escalate with attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque.